The thermometer at the Tucson Highway Authority station read 108 degrees Fahrenheit at 2:30 in the afternoon, but that was in the shade, and there was no shade where Elena Voss was standing. She had dragged her car to salvage shopping basket welded to a pair of bicycle wheels she'd pulled from a dump site outside of Maricopa to the edge of Route 79, where the desert opened up flat and colorless in every direction. Creosote bushes, cracked caliche, the occasional rusted guardrail post that marked where the road curved, and someone once had not. She'd been working this particular stretch for 3 weeks, ever since the county maintenance crew swept the section near the underpass and took everything she hadn't managed to hide. She wore long sleeves despite the heat. She always wore long sleeves. Her name, the one on her ID, the one she'd had laminated at a Walgreens in Phoenix because even homeless people need ID, sometimes, said Elena Voss. 37 years old, no permanent address. She had a P.O. box she paid for with aluminum cans and the occasional handout, and she received nothing at it except the occasional jury summons she never responded to. The people at the shelter on Drexel Road called her Ellie, and she let them because correcting people took energy she'd decided not to spend. Pastor Rodriguez said she was quiet but not troubled, which was generous. The two college-age volunteers who sorted donations on Tuesday nights called her the one with the eyes, which was less generous but more accurate. There was something about the way she looked at things, not at you, exactly, but past you, cataloging exits and angles and the spaces between people where threat could assemble itself. She noticed things most people pass through a landscape. Elena Voss mapped it. It was not a conscious decision, it was something older than decision, something that had been trained into her nervous system through repetition and consequence until it had become indistinguishable from instinct. The slope of a roadbed, the sightline from a ridge, the way a dry wash bent south at a particular gradient that told you something about how long ago water had moved through it, and therefore something about whether a vehicle could, in theory, move through it now. She cataloged all of it without meaning to, the way a musician who has practiced long enough hears the intervals inside ordinary sound. She was the only person on this section of highway who understood that the fence line at the consolidated copper property 3 miles southeast had a gap in its northwest corner, large enough for a person to move through with equipment that had been there for at least 6 weeks because she had checked it twice. She was the only person on this section of highway who had noticed that the rock formation at mile marker 47 visible from the road as a heap of collapsed sandstone that looked like every other collapsed sandstone formation in the Sonoran Desert had a navigable interior space if you approached it from the north face rather than the south. She was the only person, in other words, who had been paying the kind of attention that turned a stretch of desert highway into something legible. This was, on most days, an entirely useless skill. She noticed, for instance, that the military convoy had taken the wrong road. There were 3 vehicles, a pair of MRAPs bracketing a lighter armor personnel carrier, and they were moving too fast for a 79 approach, which suggested a driver unfamiliar with the particular grade change that came up around mile marker 44. She'd clocked their speed at roughly 55 miles per hour, which was also wrong. You didn't run that speed in MRAPs on open desert highway unless someone was pushing a timeline, or unless someone wanted to make sure they couldn't stop in time. She was 70 yards from the road, angling toward a section of guardrail she'd identified as containing a recoverable length of copper grounding wire. When the first device went, the sound hit her body before her ears, registered at a pressure wave that knocked the cart sideways and filled her mouth with grit. She was already down, face in the dirt, knees pulled under her, before the secondary detonation lifted the lead MRAP's front axle and dropped it sideways across both lanes. The whole sequence took under 4 seconds. She experienced it at the level of physics force, displacement, disorientation, and beneath the physics, something older and more specific that she had spent 6 years trying to let go of and had not fully managed. The middle vehicle, the personnel carrier, took the blast debris laterally. The rear MRAP locked its brakes, fishtailed, stopped 40 feet back in a cloud of its own dust. Fire. The personnel carrier was burning. Elena was already up. She didn't run immediately. She ran after watching the 2 rear vehicle doors open and seeing the 4 operators who poured out take up defensive positions, rifles south, rifles north, the way you did when you assumed the detonation was the opening move and the gunfire was coming. They were doing exactly what they were trained to do. What they were not doing was moving toward the burning vehicle. What they were not hearing, because the blast had probably wrecked their comms, and because the fire was loud and getting louder, was what she could hear from 70 yards away in the open desert. A child, not screaming. That would have been cleaner. A thin, repetitive sound, high and desperate. The kind a small person makes when they've already used up the part of themselves that knows how to scream. And what's left is this smaller, quieter signal, barely sound at all, more like a frequency in the chest. Elena. She covered the 70 yards in a time that would have surprised anyone who'd seen her pushing that cart along the highway shoulder for the past 3 weeks. The long sleeves were soaked through. Her boots steel-toed. A find from the donation box at the Methodist church hit the asphalt, and then the gravel shoulder, and then the dirt at the vehicle's edge without slowing. The heat coming off the personnel carrier was not heat the way a campfire is heat. It was a physical presence. A wall that pushed against her face and chest and tried to stop her. The paint on the passenger side door had already bubbled and begun to peel in long irregular strips. The rubber ceiling around the forward viewport was producing a black, oily smoke that hung low and heavy because there was no wind. There had been no wind all afternoon. The kind of still desert air that felt like the atmosphere itself was waiting for something. The blast had crumpled the front quarter of the vehicle and jammed the primary door. She could see, from the deformation pattern, that the chassis rail on the driver's side had folded inward at roughly the B-pillar, a structural failure that had probably saved the occupants from the worst of the initial blast by absorbing the force before it reached the interior, and had then become its own problem by making the primary exit inaccessible. She didn't try the primary door. She moved to the rear, which had taken shrapnel but was not structurally compromised. The blast had propagated forward, not back, which told her something about the placement and orientation of the device, information she filed without deciding to. The rear latch was hot enough to char skin, and she wrapped her left forearm against it, the sleeve. 2 layers of cotton that had been washed too many times to have much integrity but which were something between her skin and the metal, and wrenched it. It didn't open. She wrenched it again, putting her shoulder into the follow-through, leveraging from her hips the way you leveraged when you needed force from your whole body and not just your arms, and felt something in the latch mechanism give with a sound like a breaking tooth. The door swung out. Smoke poured over her, thick and chemical, burning insulation, burning hydraulic fluid, burning something synthetic she didn't try to identify. She pulled her collar over her nose and went in anyway, dropping low where the smoke was thinner, moving by memory of vehicle layout more than by sight. The interior was a narrow corridor of benches and equipment racks, most of it scattered from the impact. A man, uniformed, unconscious, mid-30s, was belted to the forward left bench, his head at an angle she recognized. Concussive unconsciousness, not structural injury to the cervical spine. The neck was loose, not rigid. He would need a hospital. He was not dying right now. She filed that and moved past him. At the rear right bench, a different situation. The child had been secured with a standard issue lap belt that had held during the blast, which had probably saved her life, and was now the thing preventing her from crawling away from the smoke. She was small, 8, maybe 9, small even for 8, with dark hair plastered against her forehead and the particular gray pallor of someone who has already been breathing wrong air for too long. Her lips were slightly blue at the corners. Her eyes were half open and moving without focusing. Elena's hands found the buckle. She knew this buckle. The military specification lap restraint with the double press release, the kind that required simultaneous depression of both side tabs, because some engineer in the 90s had decided that accidental release was a greater liability than emergency release difficulty. She'd had this particular argument with herself at 3 in the morning in a very different burning vehicle, years ago, and the argument had resolved in under 2 seconds. She pressed both tabs, pulled the tongue, and the belt came free. The girl didn't move. Her eyes were partly open and her breathing was the shallow, rapid kind. Elena got an arm under her shoulders and another under her knees and pulled her toward the open door. Moving the way you moved when you'd done this before, low, without wasted motion, turning sideways to clear the frame, with her own body angled to take the smoke and the heat, and give the child the cleanest air available in a corridor that had no clean air. She was aware of the fire spreading along the vehicle's roofline. She was aware of the secondary fuel risk from the ruptured forward tank. She was performing a running calculation she hadn't performed in years and finding, with something between relief and the particular dismay of rediscovering a capacity you'd hoped to have left behind, that her body had not forgotten the arithmetic. She got the girl clear of the door and 15 feet from the vehicle, the minimum safe distance from a secondary detonation of that fuel load, a number she knew from training she was not supposed to have, and put her down on the hard ground and knelt over her. The child's eyes opened, not focused, not quite there yet. Elena tilted her head back, opened her airway, watched her chest rise and fall. Shallow but rhythmic, adequate. "Hey," she said quietly, "I need you to breathe for me." The girl breathed, shallow but rhythmic. "Good," Elena said. "Keep doing that." She ran her hands over the girl's arms, her collarbone, her ribs, her hips, the field assessment sequence, the one that took 11 seconds when you knew what you were doing and 30 when you were learning it, and never got faster than 11 no matter how practiced you were. Because 11 was the speed of thoroughness, no obvious fractures, possible rib bruising from the belt load. The gray pallor was from the smoke, not from blood loss, no visible external hemorrhage, and the girl's skin was dry, not clammy. The girl's eyes found her face. She said something, barely a whisper, barely air. Elena leaned down. "Say it again." "Daddy," the girl whispered. The word came out in 2 careful syllables, like something being handled gently. Daddy's SEAL team. Elena went very still, not outwardly. She was very good, by now, at not going still outwardly. Inside, in the particular place where she kept things that required containment, something turned over once and settled. She looked at the girl's face. The blue was leaving her lips. The color was starting to come back in small increments. "Okay," she said. Her voice was the same level, unhurried, the voice she used when she needed to be steady for someone else's sake. "Okay, your dad's people are coming." Behind her, 40 yards north, the lead MRAP finished its secondary detonation with a sound like a door slamming shut on something enormous. The blast pressure hit them as a rolling wave of hot air. Elena curved her body over the girl without thinking about it, and the girl flinched, and then Elena sat back and said, "That's over." And the girl looked at her and believed her. She had the girl propped against a creosote bush angled away from the road, away from the smoke, in the shade that the bush offered, which was minimal but present when the 4 operators from the rear vehicle reached her. They arrived in the aggressive crouch of men who had just survived an ambush and were working on very limited information, which meant 2 of them moved to either side of her while the 3rd covered the road and the 4th kept his rifle at low ready and looked at her the way people look at things they haven't yet decided how to classify. She didn't move. She kept her hands visible, palms out, not raised, looked performative. Palms out was substantive. She kept her body between them and the child because the child was the thing that mattered, and she was the unknown variable, and she didn't want an unknown variable between a trained operator and a 9-year-old. "She needs oxygen," Elena said, loudly enough to carry over the residual fire noise. The smoke. She was breathing it for at least 2 minutes, maybe 3. Her lips were cyanotic when I pulled her out. The 4th man, a staff sergeant, she read from his sleeve, though the rank meant less than the way he moved. The particular economy of someone who'd had the excess trained out of them over many years, looked at the girl, then at Elena. His rifle didn't lower, but his trigger finger indexed along the guard, which was something. "Who are you?" "Someone who was 70 yards away when your convoy hit a pressure plate," she said. "I need you to get oxygen on her." "Ma'am, she's hypoxic," Elena said. Her voice was level. It was always level. "I can tell from her nail beds. Do you have a kit or not?" He had a kit. He was already opening it. He was a good operator. She could see it in the way he made the call in real time. The way good operators made calls, by updating their threat model rather than freezing it. The woman on the ground was speaking with clinical specificity about the child's condition. Clinical specificity from an unknown civilian was a data point that outweighed the general category unknown civilian. He got the oxygen mask on the girl, and the color started coming back slowly. The way warmth came back to a cold room in small increments. You could see if you were paying attention, which Elena was, because she was always paying attention. The staff sergeant's name was Kowalski, according to his tape. He kept one eye on the road and one on her while his 2 colleagues cleared the immediate perimeter. The 4th man, still on overwatch, hadn't moved. The device was a pressure plate, she said, not because Kowalski had asked but because the information was relevant and she had it. Single trigger, not command detonated. There was no sight line from the road that would have given a remote operator clean timing. The secondary in the MRAP was fuel propagated, not a second device. You have 1 active threat footprint, not 2. Kowalski looked at her for a long moment. "How do you know that?" he said. "Because I was watching when it went," she said. He didn't press it. Good operators didn't press things that could wait when other things couldn't. 14 minutes later, Elena heard the rotors. She counted them before she saw them 4 distinct acoustic signatures, the particular overlap of MH60 rotor wash that she recognized not from any current knowledge, but from a body memory that had not faded the way she'd hoped it would. 4 aircraft. The geometry of the response, the speed, the asset type, the number told her something specific about the command structure involved. This was not a standard scramble. This was a notification, a rapid assembly, a response to something that someone, somewhere, had already had a protocol for. She stayed where she was. She stayed very, very still. They came off the helicopters fast and clean, the way operators moved when they were performing a task they'd practiced until it was architecture, not thought efficient without being hurried, purposeful without being frantic. She counted them without meaning to. It was automatic. The same way her eyes had automatically mapped the road grade when the convoy passed. The same way she'd automatically assessed the vehicle type and speed and trajectory. 55, 4 helicopters, 55 personnel, which was an unusual deployment number. It suggested this response had been improvised from multiple elements that happened to be in proximity, pulled together faster than a standard mobilization would allow. Someone had made several calls at once and people had moved. They spread out over the site in patterns she recognized, because they were the patterns she would have specified if she'd been the one drawing the grid. She sat on the ground with the girl and did not make any sudden movements. The rifles came to her in sequence, the way attention moved through a crowd when something disrupted the expected composition. One operator saw her, then the next saw the first looking, then 3 more swung toward her, and the geometry of threat assessment self-organized around her position with the inevitable logic of physics. She was a variable they hadn't accounted for. An unknown person at the center of an ambush site, sitting with a child she hadn't arrived with, in clothing that didn't belong to any category they had a protocol for. She understood why the rifles were pointed at her. She had spent years learning how to be someone rifles were pointed at. She knew the specific taxonomy of it, the difference between a rifle pointed at you by someone who had already decided, and a rifle pointed at you by someone who was still in the process of deciding. All 55 of these were in the process of deciding, which meant the outcome was not fixed, which meant she had work to do. "I'm not armed," she said, loudly enough to carry to the outer perimeter. "I'm a civilian." I pulled the girl from the vehicle. "She has a mild hypoxic episode from smoke inhalation. Your medics should evaluate her, but she's stable." The driver of the personnel carrier is concussed and still inside the cab. Nobody lowered anything, but nobody fired, either. Staff Sergeant Kowalski said something into his radio. There was a pause in which Elena listened to the quality of the silence and determined that someone was talking to someone else about what to do with her, which meant the decision was being escalated, which meant it was going to take slightly longer than she'd prefer but would probably resolve in a way she could work with. The girl was still gripping her sleeve. "Don't let go," the girl told her. Her voice was clearer now, the oxygen doing what it was supposed to do. "I'm not going anywhere," Elena said. She meant it. She was not going anywhere because she had nowhere to go and nothing to prove, and because the child's hand was warm and she had not been holding anyone's hand in a very long time. Commander Derek Hale had been running SEAL team operations for 11 years, which meant he had a calibrated sense for when something was wrong that went beyond checklists and protocols. It was pattern recognition, mostly the accumulated weight of 10,000 hours watching how people moved and stood and held themselves under pressure. He watched Elena Voss from 30 feet away. She was seated on the ground, dressed in the rough approximation of someone who had been living outside for a while. Canvas work pants, a long-sleeved shirt despite the heat, boots that were worn but not broken down. She looked like the woman his convoy report described. Indigent, non-combatant, chance civilian. She did not sit like that person. She sat like someone who had chosen to sit. Like someone who was managing the space around her rather than simply occupying it. Her back was straight without being rigid. Her hands were visible and open, not because she'd been told to show them, but because she'd placed them that way before the rifles arrived. Her eyes moved over the site in a pattern he knew: threat assessment, exit mapping, the slow professional scan of someone calculating vectors. He'd seen it in exactly 2 categories of people in his career: combat veterans and operators. He walked toward her, and she watched him coming the way you watch something you'd already decided about, tracking his approach without any of the anxiety that a normal person would feel when the man in charge of the guns walked toward you. "You pulled her out," he said. "Yes. From a burning MRAP. Personnel carrier." Yes. He noted the correction. She knew the difference. Anyone could see it was a personnel carrier. "Most people call them all MRAPs," she said. He crouched down to her eye level. She didn't look away, didn't defer, didn't perform any of the unconscious submission cues that people produced when authority got close. She just looked at him. "What's your name?" She told him. "Elena Voss," he said. "What were you doing on Route 79 at 2:30 inches the afternoon?" "Looking for aluminum and copper wire. In 108-degree heat. Metal doesn't care about heat." He looked at her hands. The left forearm had a burn, the kind you got from pressing against something at roughly 300 degrees for approximately 2 seconds. Intentional contact. She'd used her arm to work the latch. "Why?" he said. She looked at the girl, who had fallen into the shallow, exhausted sleep of someone whose body had finally decided the immediate crisis was managed. "She was making a sound," Elena said. He watched her face when she said it, and what he saw was not pride or performance. It was something quieter and more uncomfortable, the expression of someone who had done a thing not because they'd decided to, but because the other option had never actually been available to them. He stood up. He was about to say something else when one of his operators, Petty Officer Travis Mercer, came up on his left side and said, in a low voice that was not quite low enough, "Commander, her wrist." The burn on her left forearm had pulled the sleeve tight against her skin, and when it had dried and begun to contract, the fabric had ridden up enough to expose approximately 2 inches of the inside of her wrist. 2 inches was all it took. Travis Mercer had served with a man who had served with a woman who had come out of the program. He had never seen the tattoo himself. He'd heard it described once, late at night, at a post-deployment gathering in Virginia Beach, in the way that operators described things they weren't supposed to know in fragments, in sidelong references, in the particular tone of voice that meant this is the edge of what I can say. A small mark. A specific mark. Not military branch insignia, not unit patch, not the memorial tattoos that operators got for lost teammates. Those were known quantities. Those could be cross-referenced against records. This was something older. Something that had no official existence in any database that he could legally access, and probably not in several that he couldn't. "Commander," Mercer said again. Hale looked at the wrist. He had heard the name twice in his career. Once from a retired admiral at a function he probably shouldn't have attended, and once from a man who had been very drunk and very specific about the kind of specific he shouldn't have been, and who had looked, afterward, like he wished he could unsay it. Ghost unit, not SEAL, not Delta, not SAD. Those were known quantities too, with their own mythologies and their own very real records, their own budgets and chains of command and personnel files. Ghost Unit had no personnel files. Ghost Unit had, as far as anyone in the official structure could confirm, never existed. What Ghost Unit had was a history. A specific history. A history of showing up in the particular geography between the mission is failing and there is no longer a mission, and converting one into the other by means that remained, by design, unrecorded. The tattoo on Elena Voss's wrist was the mark of someone who had operated at a level above his pay grade, above his clearance, above the knowledge of most people in the room who thought they knew where the ceiling was. He looked at her. She was already looking at him, and there was something in her expression that was not surprise, not fear, not even resignation. It was more like the expression of someone who had waited a long time for something and found that, now that it had arrived, they didn't feel the way they'd thought they would. She pulled the sleeve down. "Lower your weapons," Hale said. Nobody moved for approximately 4 seconds. 4 seconds was long enough. In 4 seconds, Hale's operators, men who had trained for years to execute orders at a level of precision that made hesitation a form of failure, processed what they'd seen. Processed it not as a briefing or an official communication or a formal introduction, but as a visual fact that landed in the specific way that some visual facts did, in the body before the brain, in a place below analysis. Petty Officer Mercer lowered his rifle, then Lieutenant Commander Walsh, on the eastern perimeter, then the 4 men stationed south, in sequence, like a wave, then all of them, and then, without anyone ordering it, without any choreography or consensus, they bowed. Not a military salute, not a formal acknowledgement, something older than procedure. Elena Voss sat on the ground in the Arizona desert in clothes that belonged to nobody, holding a sleeping child's hand, and 55 of the most capable and dangerous people assembled by the United States government bowed their heads to her. She didn't look at them, she looked at the girl. Her name had been Elena Calloway before it was Elena Voss. Before it was Elena Voss, it had been 2 other names that still existed in 2 specific file systems that she had no access to and preferred not to think about. Each name had belonged to a version of herself that she had lived inside for a specific duration, performed with specific competence, and then abandoned the way you abandoned a safe house completely without looking back, because looking back was how you got found. Hale sat with her in the limited shade of the rear MRAP while his team worked the perimeter and the medevac teams processed the other casualties, and she told him some of it. Not all, not even most, but enough for him to understand the shape of what he was looking at. She told it the way she told most things, flatly, without ornamentation, in the past tense that meant this is history, not testimony. She had been recruited at 22 out of a federal aptitude screening program that produced candidates for several different agencies, and which occasionally flagged a profile type it passed upward through a separate channel to people she never formally met. Her test results had produced that flag. She had an unusual combination of aptitudes: spatial reasoning in the 99th percentile, threat modeling that her assessors had described in their notes as pre-conscious and comprehensive, a physical capability that had surprised the evaluators who expected an analyst, and a psychological profile that described her, in the section she wasn't supposed to have read but had read the moment she was left alone with the file, as functionally unsentimental in execution. Unusually high empathic modeling may present operationally as cold but is not. They'd been right, more or less. The empathic modeling was what made her good. You had to understand what people were going to do before they did it, and you couldn't understand that without caring, on some level, about what it was like to be them. The people who performed that work without caring were less effective, and generally didn't last long. The people who cared too much burned out or made mistakes. She had found, over years, a place between those two that was sustainable, not comfortable, but sustainable. Ghost Unit operated in the spaces between the operations that had names, the preparation and the aftermath, the intelligence gaps, the situations where having an officially non-existent operative meant that certain outcomes could happen without any paper connecting them to any command structure above the level of the people actually in the field. She'd run 12 operations in 6 years, 4 of which had directly prevented the deaths of SEAL teams in theater, had prevented them by means that ranged from intelligence delivery to the kind of direct intervention that she did not describe in detail and Hale did not press her for. She'd been in 2 operations that nobody would ever officially acknowledge, in places that nobody would officially confirm she'd been, extracting people from situations that nobody would officially confirm had occurred. She'd been good at it. She'd been very good at it, which was how she'd met Nathan Voss. He'd been operating in an adjacent space from a different agency with a different mandate, and they'd crossed paths in circumstances that were classified enough that she wouldn't describe them even now, and what had happened was that he'd understood, from the first real conversation, exactly what she was without requiring it to be explained. That was rarer than most people understood. The people who could do that work were also, mostly, the people who had learned to be opaque by default, who had spent enough time being defined by their function that they'd forgotten, or chosen to suppress, the more complicated version of themselves. Nathan had not forgotten. He'd carried both versions of himself with a kind of ease that she'd found, initially, almost suspicious. She'd stopped being suspicious after about 3 weeks. They'd been together for 3 years, married for 2, when the operation in a country whose name she still didn't say, even now, went wrong in the specific way that operations went wrong when someone at a level above the people executing them decided that certain outcomes were acceptable. The calculus was clean. At that level, assets were fungible. Missions had parameters. Nathan had been outside his parameters by approximately 40 minutes when the decision was made, and the decision had been made without anyone who knew him or had worked alongside him being consulted. Nathan had been the acceptable outcome. She'd completed the mission anyway. That was the thing. She'd never been able to decide how she felt about whether it meant something good about her or something terrible, that the mission completion had happened despite everything, almost on its own momentum, her body and her training carrying her through the 48 hours after, while the part of her that was also a person found some interior room to lock herself into and wait. She'd come home and filed her report and taken her debrief, and then she'd walked out of a building in the Northern Virginia suburbs on a Tuesday afternoon and kept walking until the walking became something else, and then that something else became a structure, and the structure became a life she could survive in without becoming something she didn't recognize. 6 years. We looked for you, Hale said quietly. After the program was restructured, there were people who wanted to find you. I know, she said. I was thorough. He paused. Why? What were you afraid of? She looked at him. Not afraid, she said. Tired. There's a difference. Tired of knowing which outcomes were acceptable, she said. Of being someone who knew that, and who was good enough at the work that knowing it didn't stop me from completing it. She paused. That's a specific kind of tired. It compounds. He didn't say anything for a while. Around them, his operators moved with the quiet efficiency of people performing a task, the site being documented and processed in the methodical way that followed every engagement. The fire had burned down to a low crawl. The desert smell, creosote and mineral heat was returning as the chemical smell faded. The sleeping girl made a small sound, not distress, just the sound of a small person whose nervous system was resetting, cycling back toward baseline, the body's quiet administrative work of returning to itself after being too far from itself for too long. Elena looked at her. The color in her face was good now. Her breathing was slow and even. Her name is Abigail, Hale said. Abigail Strand. Her father is Commander James Strand. He was supposed to be on that transport. Elena looked at the child for a long moment. He wasn't, she said. No. He's in a hospital in Phoenix. A separate incident. 4 days ago, nothing life-threatening. But he's grounded. She was being transported under military escort to be with him. He paused, and the pause had a specific quality. The people who placed that device knew which vehicle she'd be in. They knew the route, the timing, and the asset composition of the escort. Elena let that land. Intelligence sourced, she said. We think so, which is why we have a very significant problem, and why there are 55 people on this road instead of the standard response complement. He understood. An intelligence compromise at that level meant the problem wasn't on the road. The problem was in a room somewhere with a computer and a clearance. You're going to need to find the source, she said. Yes, Hale said. We are. There were 2 primary approaches to a position from the east and 3 from the west if you knew the dry washes. And whoever had set the IED had used the southern wash as an exit route because the northern one had a 6-inch grade change at its mouth that would flag on drone thermal imaging, and they would have known that, which meant they had a drone profile of this terrain, which meant they had been here before this afternoon, perhaps multiple times, and had done the same kind of patient mapping that she'd been doing. That made them dangerous. Dangerous in the specific way of people who thought about terrain the way she thought about terrain. She told Hale this while the desert went on doing what it did in the late afternoon, redistributing its heat upward into the sky, going from white to amber, from hostile to something approaching beauty. "They're still here," she said. He looked at her. "How do you know?" "Because the southern wash dead ends at the old consolidated copper fence line, 3.2 miles southeast. The fence is intact on the south side. I checked it 2 weeks ago. I was looking for wire. The northwest corner has a gap, but it exits onto a county road that had a patrol vehicle parked on it this morning." She thought for a moment. They would have seen the patrol. If they went south, they're inside a box fence on one side, road on the other, your perimeter on the third. They're not going to move until your perimeter settles or until they find another option. He was quiet for a second, processing. "You've been walking this area for 3 weeks. "Yes. Every day, most days. You learn things, if you pay attention long enough." He was quiet again. She understood that he was running a calculation, the information she was providing against the question of how she had it, and what it meant that a person with her history had been living within walking distance of a route that was now the site of a pre-planned ambush. She didn't say anything to help him with that calculation because she didn't have anything that would make it simpler. And she'd learned a long time ago not to offer comfort that wasn't true. "The northern wash," he said. "Grade change at the mouth, 6 inches over 3 feet. They know about drone thermal, so they know about grade change signatures. They won't use it." She paused. "Unless they know that you know they won't use it, in which case it becomes useful again. But I don't think they're at that level of recursive planning. The device placement suggests operational competence, not strategic sophistication." He looked at her steadily. "You get all of that from the device placement. And from 3 weeks of watching the road," she said. "Where?" he said. Just that one word. She looked at the desert. She thought about the grid she'd built in her head over 22 days, the landmarks, the shadow patterns, the way the terrain features organized themselves, when you'd been watching them long enough to understand their logic rather than just their appearance. A rock formation that looked like debris from the road looked different once you'd circled it from 2 other angles on 2 different mornings and understood what the collapsed overhang was concealing from the south approach. "The rock formation at mile marker 47, she said. "There's a collapsed overhang that reads as debris from the road approach standard erosion feature. Nothing notable. But if you come from the north face, there's a navigable interior. Roughly 15 meters of covered horizontal space. Ground is flat, which is unusual for that kind of formation and suggests the floor was leveled. It's exactly where you'd stage for a strike on this stretch of road. Good concealment, clean line to the kill zone, 2 available exit vectors before the perimeter closes." Hale was already standing. "You're describing a pre-positioned tactical stage." "Yes. From memory, yes. And you map this on foot. Without equipment." She didn't answer that, because the answer was yes and she didn't feel like saying it out loud. He looked at her for a long moment, the particular look of someone who was revising their understanding of a situation in real time, who had thought they understood what they were looking at, and was now finding that the picture was larger than the frame they'd brought for it. "You should come with us," he said. "No," she said. "Elena, I'm telling you where they are," she said. "That's what I'm doing. You and your 55 operators can handle the tactical execution. That's what you're here for." He almost smiled. He had a good face for almost smiling. It was a contained expression, the kind that came from years of managing your reactions in environments where your reactions had operational consequences. "You're certain about the location." "I'm certain about the terrain," she said. "If they're inside the box I described, and they're experienced enough to have placed a device that fooled your convoy, that's where they are." He turned to Walsh and said 3 words she didn't need to hear to understand. And Walsh moved, and 6 operators detached from the perimeter and fell in behind Walsh without being further instructed, and they moved southeast at a pace that covered ground and left no sound she could hear. She looked down at Abigail Strand, who was still asleep, still breathing cleanly, still holding her sleeve. "She's still holding on," Elena said. It was not quite addressed to Hale. It was more like something she said to herself, a notation of something that mattered for reasons she wasn't ready to examine. "She is," Hale said. "Kids do that," Elena said. "They find the thing that kept them safe and they hold it, even when the safe part is over." He didn't say anything. "It's good," she said. "It means she's going to be okay." The tactical team reached the rock formation at mile marker 47 inches 14 minutes and found exactly what she described: 2 individuals with detonation equipment and communications hardware that indicated a network, a support structure, contacts that were going to require weeks of investigative work to fully map. The operation itself took 22 minutes. Nobody on Hale's side was injured. The 2 individuals were detained without significant incident, which Elena filed as confirmation of her assessment: operational competence, not strategic depth. They had planned an ambush. They had not planned an interrogation. Hale came back and told her this standing in the last amber light of the afternoon, the sky above the Sonoran Desert having made its daily conversion from white to orange to the particular deep blue that came in the final minutes before dark, when the temperature dropped 4 degrees in the space of half an hour and the desert smelled like itself again. She received the information without expression. "Good," she said. It was all she said. Abigail Strand had been loaded onto the medevac aircraft 20 minutes before the tactical team returned. The transfer had taken longer than the medics planned because Abigail had refused to let go of Elena's hand. And the refusal was not dramatic, not screaming or crying. Just the quiet, absolute insistence of a child who had decided that a specific thing was the right thing, and was exercising the only power available to her to maintain it. Elena had crouched down to the girl's eye level, which put her face very close to a small face that was looking at her with an expression she recognized from a long time ago, from before she had trained herself out of it, as the expression of someone encountering a person they recognized as safe, and trying to memorize the exact quality of that safety so they could carry it with them. "I need you to go with these people," Elena said. "Are you coming?" "I'm going to be right here. You're going to your dad." "You saved me," Abigail said. It was a simple declarative statement, offered with the particular gravity of a child who understood the weight of what she was saying and chose to say it directly. "You're the one who kept breathing," Elena said. The girl thought about this. She seemed to accept it as a fair accounting. "What's your name?" she said. "Elena." "Elena," Abigail repeated. She said it like she was storing it somewhere careful. "I'm going to remember you." "I know," Elena said. "Go be with your dad." The hand released. Elena stood up and didn't watch the aircraft leave. After the helicopters, all of them were gone. Hale and 3 operators remained. The MRAPs had been documented and cleared. A recovery team was inbound for the vehicles. The desert was doing what it always did, which was to proceed without comment, absorbing the evidence of human events with the patient indifference of something that had been doing this for a very long time, and expected to keep doing it long after the humans were done. "Come back," Hale said. It was not a demand. It was not precisely a request either. It sat in the middle, in the particular register of something that was offered without conditions here. If you want it, no pressure in either direction, except for the pressure that was already there before he said anything. "To what?" she said. "There are people." "I know there are people," she said. "There are always people. The people are not the problem." He understood what she meant, because he was paying attention, and because she'd told him enough for the meaning to land without translation. The people were not the problem. The people were the ones who ran toward burning vehicles. The people were the ones who mapped terrain in 108-degree heat for 3 weeks because something in them wouldn't let them stop paying attention. The people were the ones who cried, privately, about acceptable outcomes, and then completed their missions anyway. The people were not the problem. "No authority structure above the team level," he said. "Consulting only. You'd have review access to threat assessments in your operational geography, which appears to be wherever you happen to be living. So that's already halfway there. You'd be a resource the teams could request. Nobody could order you, except my own judgment," she said. "Yes," he said. "Except that." She looked at the desert. She thought about Nathan, which she did every day, in the quiet way that grief became when it was old enough. Not the consuming kind anymore. Not the kind that stopped your breathing, but the constant kind. The kind that had become part of the structure of your thinking. The way load-bearing walls were part of the structure of a house. You didn't notice them most of the time. You noticed them when you needed to lean on something. She thought about what he would say, and what he would say was something like, "You've been asleep for 6 years and you know it," which was not entirely fair but was not entirely wrong either. The walking hadn't been sleeping. The invisibility had been a choice she'd made for reasons that were real and had cost real things, but there was also a version of the past 6 years that she had been managing rather than living, maintaining rather than building. She was tired of that version. Not tired enough to go back to what she'd been. She was not going back to what she'd been. That door was closed, and she'd been the one to close it, and she didn't regret closing it. But maybe the choice was not binary. "James Strand is going to want to meet you," Hale said. "You can tell him I said he shouldn't let his daughter be transported without him in the vehicle." He almost laughed. "I'll tell him exactly that." She looked at her cart. It had rolled 15 feet from the road when the IED went and was sitting at a tilt. One wheel slightly bent, her aluminum collection scattered in a small radius across the caliche. 3 weeks of careful accumulation. 40 pounds of metal, maybe. Enough for 2 or 3 days of food and the cost of her P.O. box for another month. She looked at it for a long time. "She asked what my name was," Elena said. "Yes," Hale said. "When she's out of the hospital," Elena said. "When her father's out of the hospital, someone should make sure she has a stable contact. Someone she already knows." She paused. "Someone who, in the event that the intelligence compromise that allowed today to happen turns out to have implications that extend beyond today, is in a position to be aware of what those implications are. Hale was quiet for a moment. That's not really a consulting arrangement, he said. No, she said. It's not. It's something else. It's something I can do without becoming something I don't want to be, she said. There's a difference. He nodded, slowly, the way people nodded when they understood something they hadn't understood before and were deciding what to do with the understanding. He reached into a pocket and produced a business card plain, no logo, a number and a name that was not his actual name, which was how these things worked. He held it out. She took it. Make the call, she said. I will, he said. When you're ready, I said. Make the call, she said. I didn't say when. Make it now. Get the arrangement in place before I change my mind. He looked at her. He read her correctly that this was not hesitation. It was urgency in an opposite direction, that she was asking him to move fast because she trusted her own judgment, and her judgment was saying now. He got on his radio. She walked back to her cart and righted it and began gathering the scattered aluminum, working her way across the caliche in the last few minutes of the amber light. Petty Officer Mercer watched her for a moment from near the IMRAP. She felt him watching without looking up, the particular quality of being observed by someone who was recalibrating everything they'd built their understanding on. Then he walked over and bent down and picked up a crushed can without being asked and held it out. She took it. Thank you, she said. Yes, ma'am, he said. He crouched down and started picking up others. He didn't say anything else, which was right. There was nothing else to say. She worked until the light failed. Around her, the desert did what the desert did, temperature dropping 4 degrees in the first 20 minutes after dark, the creosote releasing its particular smell, the nocturnal things beginning their patient work in the growing dark, a world entirely unconcerned with the question of who you used to be, and entirely interested in the question of what you did with your hands right now, tonight, in the cooling desert, with the stars coming out one at a time above the edge of the world. She had a burn on her left forearm, healing. She had 40 pounds of aluminum. She had a business card in her pocket. She had, for the first time in 6 years, a reason to call someone. The woman who 55 operators had bowed to pushed her cart along Route 79 inches the dark, and the desert received her without ceremony, and the stars that had seen everything said nothing, as they always had, as they always would, patient and indifferent and permanent above the small, temporary, urgent business of human lives below. She would call in the morning. That much was decided.